Alright guys, hello. Welcome back to another video today. Today we're going to be covering one of the last videos on formal logic. For at least Coppin's book, that is the brief textbook on mental philosophy and logic. However, I will probably be posting more formal logic videos, especially from people like John of St. Thomas or Joseph Messier. Particularly because only studying one book is very implausible if you want to master the art of logic, and I'm here to provide the best of the best for you guys. So yeah, but we'll also cover Coppin's material logic, and maybe we'll cover John of St. Thomas's material logic in the future, but that book, especially from John of St. Thomas, is very, very abstract and complex and dives into deep concepts, especially with like the University of Being and Refutations of Scotus, but also it discusses different stuff in the categories like relation and how relation relates to the Trinity, right? And so yeah. All right, then let's get into our video for today. So today we're going to be covering method in reasoning. Now, I need you to note first that method translated really just means road, a road to something, right? Now, order is, for Coppens, a proper arrangement of parts for any purpose. So this could be practical or theoretical, right? And I don't think I have to explain much on what order really is, because even your common colloquial meanings could suffice. And method is a way of the arrangement of parts, or is a way of order, um, with a view to some practical end, right? And as Coppens puts it, in reasoning, the end is the acquisition or the communication of knowledge. So the product of reasoning is going to be knowledge. That is the ultimate goal, and that is why Aristotle says demonstration produces knowledge, or that the goal of demonstration is to produce knowledge. Now, first of um, all reasoning, Coppens follows the scholastics, but also Aristotle's line of thought. That is, all reasoning has to begin with indubitable premises, which just means undoubtable, right? In which they do not need to be supported by reasoning. Why? Because no science can prove its first principles. For example, in mathematics, geometry starts off with axioms, hint, hint, Euclid's five postulates, right, which are commonly accepted as axioms within the science of geometry. And it's from these five axioms, or 5 points, that the whole of geometry is derived by logical reason. It's the reason why you have so many proofs. I'm pretty sure there's a proof called the angle through proof for triangles and all that analytical geometry, right? But so yes, Coppens follows the line of thought of Aristotle, saying that all reasoning must be founded on indubitable premises, or certain stuff that we cannot prove, but yet we presuppose them for all types of reasoning. Um, and we need to note that these axioms or starting points are not accepted arbitrarily or subjectively, right? They are rather what we call self-evident. So Aristotle does not simply, or Coppens and Aristotle does not simply assume these things. And these axioms are, for example, the laws of logic, like the law of non-contradiction. Nothing can both be and not be in the same respect at the same time, right? So they do not just simply assume this, they self-evidently understand this by the intellect, right? And these do not need proof. Such things are not needed proof. Why? Because every proof already presupposes them. Because we realize how when you ever try to demonstrate something, you must start with more fundamental premises. But how can something be more fundamental than the laws of logic in terms of reasoning? Nothing. Exactly. That's why it's impossible. Now, I do know and I understand that that certain philosophies out there might not accept that, the laws of logic are self-evident, right? They might not be very foundationalist in the sense of, how Coppens and Aristotle is. But however, this is only this is what I'm talking about generally. What is the case with most philosophers? Most philosophers tend to be foundationalists. They do believe that the laws of logic are self-evident. But yes, and that is why in philosophy, the first principles are self-evident. The first principles simply are relating to the laws of logic. Now, the mind must first apprehend the premises before it draws any conclusion from them. That is, our intellect must understand judgments before it combines them to produce a new judgment. We say this in the logical order, that is, in the order of thought, the premises are always prior to the conclusion. However, conversely, that is reversely, when we're talking about the ontological order, this is the order of being or existence. And so a truth stated in the premises may really be after or posterior to the truth expressed in the conclusion. Alright? So, for example, from the ontological order is when we reason from an effect to its cause. This is very essential in Thomism. Remember when we covered the some of the parts of the Summa Theologiae, Thomas Aquinas says, we only could prove the existence of God from reasoning from effect to its cause, that is posteriori reasoning. And such a case is when we might reason from a beautiful picture to the skill and excellence of a painter, right? This wonderful painting in front of me, I see this and I might reason that, oh, this must have been produced by a really, really skillful painter. And since the effect is posterior to the cause and is dependent on the cause, right? Because the painting depends on the cause, right? Obviously. And so this is really analogous to how arguments for God from design, right? We see this all the time, right? We components or proponents of this argument might be like, well, we observe that in reality is things seem to be intelligently designed. For example, gravity being so precise to the point that if it were to change even a little bit, the world would completely be turned upside down, right? And then they might reason that because of this, this implies an intelligent designer, which is God. And so that is generally how this would work, right? And so reasoning from the effect to the cause is called reasoning a posteriori, and reasoning from cause to effect is a priori. And so really that's the distinction between the cosmological arguments and the ontological arguments for the existence of God. That is, the cosmological arguments tend to reason from a posteriori, or they do, while the ontological arguments are a priori arguments. And since causes are ontologically since causes are, ontologically prior to their effects, while in the logical order, the effects can be prior to the cause. Now, you must note that the terms a priori and a posteriori will not have the exact same meaning when applied to reasoning and when applied to judgments. The distinction is when you reason a priori is reasoning from cause to effect. However, when you have a judgment that is a priori, that means it's formed independent of experience. And really, that is really a epistemic distinction right there. That is the judgment a priori. And we're gonna get into more stuff because I want to get into stuff with Bonjour's conception of a priori justification. So just note of that quick distinction. So in a priori and posteriori reasonings, we look at the relations between two things, one of which is ontologically prior to the other, that is, the cause is ontologically prior to the effect. And so while in analytical and synthetical reasonings, we only consider one thing, which is studying the relations between the whole being and its parts. So remember, quick distinction. A priori and posteriori reasonings concern a relation between two things, while synthetical and analytical reasoning considers only one thing, and which is its whole being and its parts. So, for synthetical and analytical reasoning, if we know the whole being, then if we want to discover its parts, we are said to analyze the subject, which we then proceed analytically. But if we know the parts first and want to discover the whole, we are said to then proceed synthetically. So the metaphysician takes an idea as a whole and the notes of it as parts. And now notes simply is the attributes or qualities or the predicates of a concept, right? So for example, the metaphysician might look at the concept of a triangle. He looks at the notes, that is the predicates involved or contained in the concept of a triangle, and he finds analytically that a triangle is a three-sided shape with interior angles adding up to 180 degrees, right? And Coppens also gives the example. The chemist analyzes a mineral to discover its simple ingredients. The apothecary combines simples into compounds. The synthetic geometrician puts together lines and angles to find the properties of surfaces and solids, while the analytical geometrician finds the particular mathematical relations implied in a general formula. And so we must also say that the idea, which is the concept analyzed, is less extended or has less of an extension than the notes, that is the predicates or attributes. For example, every tree is a substance, but not every substance is that tree. So let me break down this quick example if you don't really get it. So if we look at the concept or the idea, tree, it's actually less extended than it's one of its notes, that is substance. Now, here's the reason why. Now, substance, if you remember watching categories, or if you watch my videos on the categories, or you just really, if you at least read the book, substance is the most primary category in the 10 categories. Substances have primary existence. Now, a tree is said to be a substance, right? It's a thing. You can predicate things of it, right? Yeah. And so basically, every tree is a substance, but not every substance is a tree. Because why? Because substances could be dogs, humans, animals, it could be rocks. It doesn't necessarily have to be a tree. So while every tree has a while every tree can be applied to substance, it's less extended to compared to substance, because substance can be predicated of so many things. Substance can be predicated of so many species. It could be predicated of many genuses, right? Animals are substances, right? Rocks are substances. A house is also considered a substance, right? And so yeah, thus we must say that first of all, the synthetic method, and we need to be careful because I'm going to elaborate because this is going to seem counterintuitive. That is, the synthetic method is when we proceed from the universal to the particular. That is, oh my goodness, I just switched up the whole thing. That's my bad. Let me fix that real quick. Okay. Sorry guys, I just reworked the slides, so if you see the change, literally the change was I kind of just switched the in synthesis and the in analysis because I accidentally, swapped them. But basically, in synthesis or the synthetic method, we start with general ideas: substance, living, sensitive, right? So the differences, whatever, and then we combine them into a specific concept, or we reason to a particular concept, like animal. And while the analytic method, which is also known as the inductive method, as I've got from Elements of Logic by J.D. Messier, we proceed from the particular to the universal. And so in the analytic method, we start with a specific idea or a particular idea like tree, and then we break it into broader notes. That is the predicates like substance, material, it's living, blah, 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 whatever, right? And so a science could use either synthesis or analysis, and now one and then the other. Now, this is where I wanted to get to. This seems wrong, right? Because how can reasoning analytically mean we proceed from the particular to the universal, and synthetically from the universal to the particular? So really, I believe you need to note down that Coppens is really just using these words in two different senses. And so that is why I got help from J.D. Messier. If you read his book on Elements of Logic, it is really one of the other great logic books that I would recommend. I would also recommend A Catechism of Logic by Christian B. Wagner, because that's like literally almost the same as Coppens' book, if not literally the same. But the synthetic method, according to J.D. Messier, is the deductive or the constructive method used in exact sciences like arithmetic and geometry. Because, arithmetic, mathematics, and geometry are deductive, right? And so their conclusions are necessitated 100%. And so it is the process by which we begin with general principles or axioms like Euclid's 5 postulates, and then we combine them logically to derive new relations or conclusions. So this could be certain proofs in geometry. Like, I don't even know. I forgot like thousands of theorems already, right? So it moves from the simple to the complex, and from the general to the less general. That is, from universal truths to particular conclusions. In other words, the synthetic method starts with first principles that are self-evident or were previously demonstrated, and then uses them to build up knowledge of more specific or complex truths. Now, the analytic method is the method of the positive sciences, that is, the empirical or the experimental sciences like psychology, physics, chemistry, biology, environmental sciences, right, etc. In other words, these stuff, or the analytic method, it starts with observed facts, like experience, data, and then it just ascends to general laws that explains those facts, right? So it's like induction. Now, when we were first explaining ideas and the union of ideas into judgments, and then the combination of judgments into syllogisms, hence those are the 3 acts of the intellect: apprehension, judgment, and reasoning, we used synthesis. But when we were analyzing the nature of reasoning, so as to discover the rules or things that must guide it, we used analysis, right? And so notably, synthesis is better for building and explaining knowledge, that is, and you could also, it's better for teaching, while analysis is better at breaking down knowledge to understand it and suited for the investigation of truth. Now, we also look at how sciences are distinguished. Now, first of all, listen, because this is a really important thing. First of all, sciences are distinguished from other sciences by their object. For example, logic is distinguished from metaphysics because logic, although it focuses on being, right? Because metaphysics and logic, they focus on the same thing, that is being. But they are different sciences. Why? Because of their formal objects. Logic focuses being of thought or being of reason, while metaphysics focuses on real actual being. But when sciences treat of the same object, like geology, geometry, and geography, or like mathematics and physics, they view that object differently, right? Because physics views quantities in relation to the world, while mathematics studies these quantities abstractly. It's like the same with logic and psychology. The view they take of their objects is called their formal object, how they view the thing. And the object itself is called the material object. And so sciences are more correctly specified by their formal objects. So whenever you want to distinguish a science from another, what's the difference between the sciences? You always got to look at its formal object, right? First look at its material and then formal. Formal is the view. And so Coppens also says that a science is more or less valuable or worthy in terms of nobility in proportion as its formal object, or its material object as well, is more or less worthy of man, right? And so it seems that then that the science of theology is therefore the noblest out of all science, because it views all of its objects as they are known by the highest light, which is the supernatural light of divine revelation. And now you might disagree with that, right? But this is Coppens' view, okay? And so philosophy, for Coppens, is the most noble science in terms of the human sciences. That is, philosophy is more noble than physics. Mathematics is the most noblest out of all natural sciences. And by natural here, please do not get confused by natural. By natural, I mean sciences that are that can be done at least to the extent to which human reason can explore, right? And so philosophy is the most noblest because of its formal object being the most intellectual in all things, which is their very essence or nature and the relations to the highest good. So you remember, philosophy is defined as the science of wisdom by Aristotle, but is also defined as the science of the highest causes, right? And so Coppens also makes an interesting point, which is that the truth in any science can never come into conflict with the truth of any other science, since truth is objectively absolute and is not relative, since it is that which is. Thus, Coppens seems to be a proponent of the epistemic theory, that is the correspondence theory of truth. That is, a thing is true if it corresponds to, something in reality. Or if, hopefully that's not a strawman of that position. And so Coppens seems to be a proponent of this position. So he believes truth is correspondence to a state of affairs in the world or a fact, right? And so really, remember, truth for the scholastics is being, and falsity is non-being. That is why and by the way, that's why the law of excluded middle is a thing, right? Because every proposition must either be true or false. Why? Because truth is being, and falsity is non-being. But you can't have a middle ground between being and non-being, right? It's just not possible, since being is the most simplest thing. Now, if two sciences appear to contradict, Coppens says it's most likely that one of the teachings is unproven, or they're just impossible to prove. And so that basically wraps it up for method and reasoning. If you do have any questions, especially I know the part about synthetic and analytic method can be confusing, because typically when we think about the analytic synthetic distinction, we always think about analyticity as deductive, kind of deductive reasoning. But we need to be careful here, because we are looking at a different framework here. But basically, yes, if you have any questions, please ask me. I will be making more videos on the formal logic series, and I will try to upload more often now than ever. Alright, have a good day, guys. Yeah, see ya.